Hello and welcome back to the Future Value Podcast. I'm John Pellosie alongside Joe Freemont and Justin Ahner. And today we've got a special episode for you. You know, here on the podcast, we talk about a lot of very technical things, right? We talk about cash management and investments and debt and all that kind of stuff. Well, today's a little bit different because we're talking about love. Talking about love and money, and specifically what we're going to be talking a lot about is wedding planning. So wedding finances, and then some talk about after the wedding in marriage, how people might decide that they want to structure their finances, and hopefully just give some people some different ideas on what the options are there. So this is near and dear to our heart because our very own Joe Freemont is a recently married man.
That's
Congratulations.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm best qualified to, having gone through all that very recently, to kind of give a little bit of insight and kind of behind the scenes hood on what goes on behind the scenes for a finance guy's perception of a wedding here. So I think to start off, I think something that everybody has a little thought of in the back of their head when they start planning for a wedding is, am I receiving any support? Right? So my recommendation to any young couple getting started, maybe you just got engaged, is have the awkward conversations up front. So not every conversation is going to be super comfortable. If you are anticipating that maybe that your parents or maybe some relative might help you out with your wedding, I encourage you just maybe invite them out to lunch, maybe invite them out to dinner, and just say, hey, do you have any intention of supporting us in any way for this upcoming wedding? And I would just encourage that because it gets the awkwardness out of the way, right? We had that conversation with both my parents and my wife, Jen. Wife, wow, it's a new word for me there. But having that conversation up front really eased the tensions with it because it establishes the expectation, right? Mm-hmm. I know that I'm going to get X from my parents and I'm going to get X from my future in-laws, right? Mm-hmm. And then that way nobody's upset, nobody's comparing which way or under, but it can get to be a little uncomfortable because it is one of the three things that you don't talk about, right? Finances, money, and politics, right? So having that conversation up front is a very great start to the wedding process there.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, Joe, because I think you touched on something that was really good, and that word expectations. Mm-hmm. I feel like in a lot of different dimensions, we'll probably talk about that as we go through here, right? Like expectations around that wedding day can really be really high, certainly on the part of the bride and groom, right, and what they want their day to look like, but also sometimes what the family wants that day to look like too, right? Mom and dad might have a vision of what they want their the wedding day for the kids to look like. So I think you're absolutely right, it is really important to have those discussions and move from, what we say, expectations to agreements, right? And understand, if there's going to be some support, right, what does that look like in the wedding, right? And if there isn't, well, then maybe the expectations have to change a little bit, right?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, as the oldest son and the first to get married in the entire next generation of my family, there was some pretty big expectations on my end. We're not going to sit here and pretend that three guys in finance are going to necessarily tell you everything and which qualification that you are looking for in the wedding venue for your and your spouse to be special day. Because let's be honest, right? We're really interested in the numbers, right, for the most part. But while the aesthetic parts play a big role, there's a couple other considerations that you might want to think about for your venue. Right. First off, number one, that first comes to mind for me because I have a lot of family outside of the immediate Lehigh Valley, is where's the hotel, right? Yeah. Are my friends and family going to stay on site after the reception is done, right? Encourage some responsible behavior after the night is over, right? Or are they going to have to travel to an off-site hotel to get that? Am I providing that transportation to that off-site hotel? Transportation can get very expensive, as I'm sure we'll cover later on in that. And the more things that your venue provides, right? So some venues we will provide the food, we will provide the bar, right? So you'll have the food and liquor covered in your package. Well, guess what? That comes with a lot more expenses in it, right? You're not just purchasing the venue for the night of an empty shell. There's a lot more that kind of goes on behind the scenes with that, right? Mm-hmm. So all of these are kind of financial considerations that you want to have when considering a venue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like understanding, I guess when you're comparing venues, right? Like it's, You've got that place that's a little bit more packaged, right? Like it's
Right.
the venue, it's the food, it's whatever. That's going to have a price versus if you have a place where it's just the space, right? Factoring in all those others, like what's the space plus the catering plus all that kind of stuff, right? In order to get a good comparison.
Yeah, because you might look at on paper and you might say, oh, this venue that I see at a winery down the road from my place of residence is offering everything but food and the bar. Oh, well, of course it's cheaper, right? It doesn't include some of that major expenses that you're going to have, and then you're going to have to go out and outsource them to come in, right? So it's a big financial consideration for that. One other part that I think is really important to point out is looking out for minimums on venues, right? So back in the day, it used to be very simple for weddings, right? It used to be, how many guests am I inviting? How much does it cost to provide them a good amount of food and an adequate amount of liquor or however alcoholic beverage that you want. But these days, it's gotten a little bit different, and the wedding industry has kind of evolved a little bit since then. So if you're not aware, welcome. Your venue might have minimums that you have to hit depending on the size of the venue, right? So the venue that my wife and I ended up deciding to have on had a certain limit that you had to hit between the food, the alcohol, and any additions that you might have to add on to hit that minimum, right? And sometimes maybe you want the addition just to have an extra nice thing at your wedding, right? But what they don't tell you when you hit the minimum, right, or what to get to that minimum is that there might be hidden fees. So I want to make sure that you read the fine print on that contract right there. So something that I've seen, and you might see anything from a 20 to 25% automatic gratuity on that venue service. Wow. Yeah. And not to mention, booking a venue might be considered a taxable service. So Uncle Sam wants his cut, right, as he usually does, and he usually gets it, right? But just to kind of put that in terms of numbers here, if you had a $20,000 minimum, you're going to have 150 to 200 people maybe at your wedding. If you had 25% gratuity and 6% withholding for Uncle Sam, it turns your $20,000 minimum up to $26,200. Wow. So that's an extra $6,200 that you might not be considering when you're putting into your wedding budget to account for that wedding day.
Yeah, that's a big jump, and that's an easy one. I feel like in the midst of planning and the excitement of it, like to not understand how much more, tax and that gratuity is going to tack on. One thing I'll share. So I've been married coming up on 3 years now, right. And our venue we had a minimum as well. I think another thing that is helpful in the planning is understanding how if you're going to be using a venue that has minimums, or maybe you're comparing a couple and they both have minimums. The flexibility around how each venue designs its package. So one of the things that I'm very happy about where we had our wedding was they had a minimum, but the way that you could get there was very flexible, meaning, they were fully customizable on like the food and drink packages to get to that price that for your number of guests was going to hit that minimum. So I think that understanding that flexibility and like that customization at your venue is really, really important versus maybe another one that's a little bit more take it or leave it, and you gotta take what they're offering.
All right, Justin, as the non-married person, are you scared yet, or are you still with us?
I see him taking a lot of notes.
Yeah, I've taking them up here. Lots of things that I've never even considered or knew that were things. Like those minimums. Mm-hmm. Not something I would have ever realized was there. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely educational. Hopefully, it's educational for you as well, because honestly, it probably will be coming up soon for me. So. Right. Definitely going to put this in my back pocket for later.
Wonderful. I think the next thing to talk about, so we've talked about the venue, right? Hopefully that's the biggest thing, right? And hopefully your biggest expense that you have on your special day. But I think selecting your vendors, right? You can buy the venue and your guests can show up, but if you have nothing else there, it might just be a pretty quiet food and beverage night, right? So I think something that's really important is identifying and having those conversations, going back to expectations with your spouse-to-be on what are really important vendors that you don't want to kind of necessarily cheap out on, right? So for me, I had this conversation with my now wife, and I said, okay, well, for me, it's really important that we have an amazing DJ and that the photos turn out very, very well, right? And to my wife, what was really important was two things. Number one was the flowers. The flowers were especially important to her, which I might add is probably going to be one of your more expensive vendors, right? Never underestimate how much good flowers can cost. But number two was the cake. And for us, it was having a cutting cake and plenty of cupcakes for our guests to have, right? But if you don't have those expectations and talks about that, right, you might account for, hey, you know what, I really wanted a great DJ, but maybe I had to cut a little bit back on that. And then maybe you notice that dip in quality is there, right? So identifying your non-negotiable vendors with your spouse is probably really necessary for that. One more thing that to point out for that. So just realize that there is the venue costs, right? There's the venue costs for having the day at the venue. There's the vendors, right? So your DJ, photographer, maybe videographer, flowers and more, right? But there's also stuff that you don't always think about that might not be included with your venue.
Okay.
So think about postage. You got to mail everybody invitations.
Yeah, that's true.
Nobody's going to show up if you don't send them something, unless you're, I don't know, on an email chain or something else there. Signs, designing and customizing signs for your special days. Sign holders. Your venue might not have a sign holder to the sign that you've designed, right? And then something that was trendy that my wife and I did was we did a custom mirror, right? So there was a full-size mirror that your guests can take a picture in, and it has your name, your wedding day, and a little bit of fun sayings on it, right? So these are things that maybe your spouse to be is thinking about, or maybe you are thinking about, that you want to make sure that you make a line item for those extra costs associated with the wedding.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The postage on the invites is interesting, because obviously stuff with weddings has changed. A lot of people have wedding websites now on the Knot and Zola and all these different websites, but I haven't seen anyone go to a fully digital invite yet.
Yeah, no, I have not either.
So that's still, postage is still a thing, believe it or not. Good old snail mail for weddings. You got to count on that.
Some of those older relatives, they need that
true.
physical thing, or maybe they need that magnet that you're going to pass out at the family reunion. You're just going to slap that on the TV, right? Or not the TV, but the refrigerator. Yeah, so.
All right. So now you're married. You have the beautiful wedding day that you've always wanted, and you've done it in a financially responsible way too. Hopefully. So now you're married. Let's talk a little bit about what does that look like from a financial perspective, right? Talking about kind of combining people's financial lives. Have you and Jen, your new wife, had conversations about that?
We have, and I'll have to refer you to our special episode on cash management, where we talk a lot about the day-to-day finances there. But I will say we are in the process of working on getting, first off, her name changed. She's taking my last name, but getting her added to each of the accounts, right? So there's a whole process that we're not going to go into today on how you change your name, but part of the process is, making all the appointments to make sure she's added to the checking accounts, the savings accounts. I have a non-retirement investment account that we're going to make a joint account. Mm-hmm. So we're in the process of doing all that. And we manage everything in a couple different accounts, right? There's project accounts on our banking site. So I have special savings accounts that are for vacations, maybe saving up for a home one day. I don't know. It's a crazy real estate market out there, but maybe one day we hope to own a home. And also, I have to say that my wife and I, she is a budgeting master. I would have never thought when I first met her that she would be so great at being in the spreadsheets.
Okay.
She loves tracking every little item, knowing, we spent X amount on food, which is X% more than what we spent 2 months ago, and we need to really do this, and that. And I, on the other hand, am not good at spreadsheeting that daily budget. I need some sort of service or something that tracks it and categorizes it for me, which I would argue that maybe your credit card, if you do a lot of purchasing for you, does that, but it's not necessarily to the same detail that you can do if you do it manually, right? So I like focusing more on the high level, where are we heading direction there, but that's been our experience so far.
That's interesting. So you and Jen kind of together, you decided you really wanted to combine a lot of stuff, right? Like have more joint account versus like his and her stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we still, there's a couple things that are still individual name, right? So obviously there is still accounts that are still separate, but for day-to-day spending, we're still keeping separate credit cards, right? So she's had a couple cards before she came and met me, and I've had a couple credit cards before that. We might add an authorized user on that, but not necessarily completely joint all that just yet.
Yeah. What I've found working with clients is obviously there's a lot of different ways that people structure it. I think one of the things that's interesting now is I think husbands and wives nowadays, maybe more than in prior generations, are coming to marriage with separate financial lives, maybe a little bit more developed, right? In older days when maybe people were getting married younger, like really early 20s and stuff like that, they probably didn't have all that much on their own before they got married. So it was very easy that you got married, you got a joint bank account, you bought your house together, right? A lot of things were done together. And now I think with having more kind of financial independence earlier before marriage, it does add that level of complexity in that conversation. I think that goes back to some of those conversations, right, that you have to have and say, listen, do we want to run our finances jointly together? Are we going to keep separate accounts? And I've seen all different examples of it. I'll share my wife and I, we use joint accounts as well. I have a number of clients who husband and wife have separate bank accounts and they run separate expenses through there. Sometimes they have separate accounts, but a main account where things flow into. There's all different ways to do it. I think my recommendation for people, just in general, would be whatever way you do it, I think it's important that you know where you stand as a couple or as a family at any time. Meaning, I've definitely seen situations where people, they know what they have in their bank account. Husband knows what's in his bank account, has no idea what's in the wife's bank account, and therefore they don't know what they have as a couple.
Right.
I think that's less than an ideal situation, right? I think you need to have an understanding as a family unit, kind of where you're standing at any given time in your finances. So that would be my recommendation to you all out there. However you structure your finances as a couple, make sure you have a pretty good picture overall of where things stand.
I think some other things while we're still on the family, combined finances, is just making sure that you have the right protections in place, right? I think there's a lot of things, everybody first thinks to, I want to make sure that we're on joint name in the bank accounts and investments. And I think what often gets left behind is things that aren't necessarily accounts that you're thinking about, right? So John mentioned earlier, joint name in home on the deed, right? The home deed, right? That you want to make sure that that's in both names, right? And also I would actually encourage people to be in joint name on maybe the car as well. And the main purpose for doing that is so that you avoid what we call here, at least in Pennsylvania, is the probate tax, right? So if you don't have that in joint name, it's going to flow through your estate, your last will and testament. And while your spouse certainly has the unlimited gifting rule, right? There's no necessarily any tax on that for your spouse. It just makes it so much easier in the event that you're no longer there to easily pass that asset to your spouse.
Right. Definitely. That's good advice. And it's easy things to think about, not think about.
Right.
Jillian, well, cut that back. You're right, Joe. And it's easy things to let kind of slip, those non-financial things. Right? The financial things, they take some effort, but you usually can get them done pretty quick, like the bank accounts.
Right. Yeah.
Other things like a deed or a car title, it's going to take probably a little bit more effort, but it's very good to have. As Joe pointed out, there's protection in an estate situation, right? God forbid if someone were to pass away. There also can be some protection from a legal perspective and a legal liability perspective from lawsuits and things of that nature. So I think if you have that agreement that we really do want to run a lot of our financial life together, you definitely want to make sure you're accomplishing that across all of your assets, like you said.
Yeah, so, I was trying to be a sponge and absorb as much as possible over here. And I have two main takeaways that I got from the conversation today. The first being that conversation is extremely important. The first being communication is extremely important. Having that conversation and understanding, that you're both on the same page, that you feel similarly, similar values and ideas on how you want it to be structured. Just being on the same page as that spouse or significant other is crucial to the success ultimately. Trying to relate back to my situation personally, I am living with my long-term girlfriend, so we're not married. We don't have the joint accounts yet, and we don't have any combined finances per that definition. But certainly, we do have a household idea of who's paying for the groceries or who's paying for the mortgage, and just being on the same page. It comes right back to that communication piece of I'm going to cover groceries, you're going to cover utilities. Just being in agreement on who's paying for what. And similarly, it could even relate to someone who has a roommate. Just understanding who's paying for what. That way you don't have bills that slip by, or all of a sudden the water or the power is cut, because somebody wasn't communicating on who was responsible for what. So those are the main takeaways that I had from our conversation today. I know I'm looking forward to the day when I get married. I'm not so sure my wallet and my bank account is, though. I'm sure it'll be well worth it.
Allie, if you're listening, we've got him on record over here. Yeah. He's excited.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Future Value Podcast. Hopefully you found this helpful and interesting, and we look forward to coming to you in a future episode. Take care.
Take care.